I'm going to show you how to make a multi-layer screen print using hand-drawn stencils. First of all, again, as always, you need to figure out what you want your screen print to look like. There are lots of ways to build an image through layers using hand-drawn stencils in screen printing. So first of all, just think about what you want your image to look like. I have some examples here from past classes. So this is an example of kind of like a classic way to build an image in screen printing using what we call a key line. So a darker outline that kind of encapsulates the entire image, tidies things up, and also shows detail. And then we have behind it what we call spot colors. So just colors in the background that show different areas of the print. So in this case, the student planned out, okay, I want the key line here, I want the blood of the sailors' bodies on top of the water, I want this to be blue, and then I want this kind of like gray crowd behind. He even did orange eyes and this color for the hair. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 layers. So each of these background layers was printed first, and then the key line printed on top. And so depending on how you're going to build your image, there are different types of registration that I would recommend. So once you figure out how you want to build your image, I can help you with registration. So this is one way to go. Another way is to create an image just out of different areas of color positioned together. So in this drawing, there is no key line, but you can see that these like dark blues and reds are used throughout the entire composition to create kind of like nice variety throughout, but there is no key line. So if this is the way you want to go, there's a particular method of registration that we would use. Here's an example of kind of building an image in a collage-like manner. So using overlap, kind of like tension between these very like geometric forms and more like expressive types of mark making. And so this is another way that you could build an image. Here's an example, again, of an image that has smaller details in it, such as these like little dark details. This person also screen printed white on top, which like is kind of an unnecessary layer if you plan properly, because you could just leave these areas of the screen open and the paper would show through, creating that white layer. So, you know, if you don't want to screen print an extra layer of white, you can plan accordingly to use the paper to your advantage. And then here's another example of building an image with spot colors and a key line. When you're thinking about how you want to draw your layers, there are a lot of different types of materials that you can use, and I have examples of those here. First and foremost, if you're just wanting to like draw normally, I highly recommend these Faber-Castell Pitt artist pens. They're made with India ink. So what's happening here is you're going to be getting sheets of this like transparent vellum. This paper does not block the light. The UV light travels right through it. So if we were to put a blank sheet of this on the exposure unit with a screen, it wouldn't block any areas of the screen. Once we start adding light blocking materials like India ink, the screen, it will block the light in those areas where we apply India ink. So it's actually with Rubylith, we're like removing the material that we don't want to print. And here we're adding material that we want to print. So Rubylith is reductive, hand-drawn method is additive. So if you want to work this way, I recommend these Pitt Artist pens. The India ink will block the light. I've had bad luck with Sharpie because it's not opaque enough. It doesn't block the light enough, so sometimes I have issues washing it out. The Sharpie paint pens, though, work really well. You can also use just straight up India ink out of a jar. So these are really good methods for kind of building a very like opaque stencil. There's other ways that you can be like kind of expressive and like more experimental. So here I have actually the stencil sheet as well as the printed image. So, and this has like a variety of different types of materials that you can use. You can cut out like pieces of black paper or like really thick white paper. Those will block the light, so that's what those look like when they're printed. They have these kind of nice like frayed edges. Here we have the Sharpie paint marker, so you can see that that blocks the light quite nicely. Here we have a litho crayon number 3, which is right here, and it gives you kind of like this crayon-y aesthetic. There's micron pens here. You can see that this red micron pen didn't work at all. This is graphite here, so depending on like how thickly you apply graphite, it'll be there. This is Sharpie, so you can see if you want a really like dark line, you're not going to get it with Sharpie. But if you want a kind of like sketchy line like that, then that's maybe something that you want to go with. This is screen filler painted on here, so it gives you, you know, it's not blocking the light entirely, but you are getting those paint strokes. So, you know, you're welcome to be experimental. We also have, there's spray paint in here. If you spray like the little dot pattern onto your sheet, you will get that speckled pattern to show through. So there's also different ways that you can incorporate texture. This is also tape that's like layered on. Sometimes people expose objects. For example, once I like scattered petals all over the exposure unit and exposed those. Just make sure if you're going to expose objects that they are not sharp in any way that will damage the screen. So I'm going to show you 2 methods of registration. The first method of registration, we're going to create a key line that will print first, print our spot colors on top, and then reprint our key line. So to make my key line, I took an image that I had used for a woodblock print that I wanted to turn into a screen print. I laid this transparent sheet on top of 11 by 14, so this is the same size as my paper, and this would help me with placement. And then I traced over the lines, but I wanted to exploit more the like ability to get detail using these thinner India ink pens. So I traced over everything, went over the lines, but went over a little bit more in detail with the Pitt Artist pens. And I also made this little border because she kind of felt weird floating in the air. Once I had created this key line, I taped it down. And then I took a clean sheet of vellum, laid it on top. My vellum is cut to the same size as my future printing paper so that I can line everything up nicely. And then I was figuring out, okay, which layer do I want to do? If I wanted to do her hair, I would trace around her hair and then color it in, which I did here. So I colored in her hair and also the stereoscope, that's my brown layer. And then I wanted a layer for her skin, so I again lined it up, colored in her skin, traced around those areas, and then colored it in. Boom, skin color layer. And then I also wanted a layer for the background, so again, lined up my vellum, taped it down, traced over the background, colored it in, and then I have my background layer. So I have 4 layers of a screen print. If I was doing the other method of registration, which uses registration marks, I took my key line and I put these small little registration marks in 2 of the corners. You could put them in 4 corners if you want, but I think 2 is sufficient. And when I put my fresh piece of vellum on top to trace the layer, I'm also copying where those registration marks are in each corner and then proceeding through the layers. So here I have my background layer, made sure to put those registration marks in the corner and then traced around the background, colored it in. Here I have my skin color layer, again, made sure those registration marks are in the exact same spot, which I taped it down. And then traced around and colored in the face. And then the same thing for my last brown layer. Put the registration marks in the same spot, traced over her hair and the stereoscope, and then colored them in. So now I have 4 layers with registration marks in the exact same spot. All right, so I have exposed what I've decided to print first as my first layer, the background, to this screen. Got it all set up. And I'm also going to show you how to do a blend or a gradient or a split fountain, whatever you want to call it, to create nice atmospheric effects in the background. So I have a light blue and a little bit of a darker blue. And I'm going to start with the darker blue. Take the darker blue. I'm going to, start to spread it out. I kind of want it just to be closer to the bottom. So I'm only putting it like halfway where I want it to be located on the image. And then I'm taking the lighter blue, filling in the other side. Like that. And then I'm gonna take my squeegee, because if I were to just pull it down right now, there would be this kind of like solid line rather than a smooth gradient. So to make that gradient, I'm gonna do a little bit of mixing with my squeegee. So I'm mixing it back and forth, and then side to side. Back and forth, side to side. And I kind of want there to be, depending on how gradual you want the transition, you can mix accordingly. I'm gonna want there to be a nice big area where it mixes. And you can do a gradient with however many colors you want. Just start with 2 today because it's gonna be a sky. All right, so that's looking good. I'm gonna flood my screen and print on the acetate. And there we go. So if I'm using my registration marks, I can see there's 2 little X's there. To line it up with where I want it to print on my paper, I can use have my paper underneath, and then I have my key line as a guide, so I can line that up and then put it underneath, make sure it's still lined up. And this is just to get the general placement on my page. Because if I print it too close to one corner, I'm gonna lose part of my border. So this is looking pretty good. When I feel like I have it lined up, I'm gonna flip on the vacuum so my paper doesn't move. And I'm going to put tape corners at the edges so I know where to place my paper. have one printed with registration marks in the corner, you're gonna wanna cover up the registration marks on your screen so they don't print on subsequent prints, because nobody wants a print with the registration marks. It's kind of like showing, you know, like the magician's trick or whatever. So once you have one with the registration marks and you've established where you're placing your paper, cover up the crosses on your screen with packing tape. Just a couple little pieces like that. And that way they won't print. If you ever have weird little holes in your screen that are printing in spaces that you don't want, you can always just cover them up with packing tape. So now I would place another sheet of paper within my registration marks and print again. And continue through until the edition is finished, and then I would be ready to print my next layer. If I'm using the other method of registration, I have already printed my key line in this transparent silver, like this. And the silver is like, you know, it's transparent enough, it's like almost not even there, but it is a good kind of like map of where to place our layers. And for this method of registration, you do not need the marks in the corners, so you don't need to put them if you're gonna print the silver layer first. I would suggest this like silver method if you're doing anything with like lots of itty bitty detail, lots of little colors that need to line up, because this is going to be your best bet that your key line is going to line up with your spot colors, because you're using the key line as a guide. The one drawback is that sometimes you can see a bit of the silver underneath if you don't get it to line up correctly. But if you're using the silver method, I have already exposed another screen with the key line. I printed all of my pages that I'm going to print on in silver, and then once I have my second layer on my screen, I can just take the acetate like this, line it up where I want it on here. Perfect. Turn on the vacuum. And print. And so I would print on top of all of my silver prints, and then I'll print my brown layer and my skin color layer, and then I'll print the key line again in either a black or a dark gray. So another reason people don't like to do this silver method is because you have to print the same layer twice. So there's a little bit of extra labor involved that way, but if you want spot on registration, this is the way to go. If you really don't want to expose your key line twice, then I would suggest using these corners. If you're not using keyline, like a keyline image for your screen print, then sometimes just this acetate method works fine, and you can just eyeball it each time. So depending on how you want to build your image, you will require a different method of registration. All right, so when lining up your second layer, I'm going to print the brown. Again, tape up your screen, put some ink along the top of your image. Print onto the acetate. Blood. There's our guide. So now, just like before, I'm going to use the little X's to line up with the X's that are already on my proof. And I can also, you know, use my image as a guide because I can see that the brown fits into the blue. And when you've got it lined up, turn on the vacuum. Make your tape corners just like before. Now we've got it in the right spot, so I would tape off the corners on the screen and complete the printing of this edition. If you're using the silver outline, just use the acetate each time, line up our image, kind of like a coloring book with the lines there. Once we've got it in the right place, turn on the vacuum. Because I found the brown was a little bit light, and you can definitely do that. And then we're ready for our next layer, which is the skin, and then we'll reprint the key line. Now I will print the skin tone peach layer. Line it up. And if you're printing on the key line, and now for our final key line layer. Print it in this dark gray. Print onto the acetate. Always remembering to flood. And then if we printed our layers correctly, everything should line up. And if you're printing on top of your silver layer, make sure that you're printing as best as you can on top of that silver layer so that nothing shows through. For this layer, you can use the tape guides, but it's sometimes best to always double check with the acetate to make sure that it's lining up. And when you've got it in the right place, turn the vacuum on. If you're finding that there's not enough like vacuum strength, you can take some smaller pieces of newsprint and lay them over the other exposed holes, and this will make sure that the suction around your image is a lot stronger. So if it's constantly lifting up after you print, it's a good idea to cover up some of the holes. And there she is. If you're having trouble printing certain layers, it's always good to proof onto newsprint. So if part of your image isn't printing, just grab a piece of newsprint, print. If you find that ink is squishing underneath your screen, another thing you can do is use the off contact method. So take a couple of pieces of mat board, tape them together. We have some that are already taped together over there. And then tape them to the edges of your screen. And this will ensure that every time you print that your screen is lifting immediately up off of your image. So there's several things you can do to troubleshoot your printing. But it is always satisfying to see your image come together in the end.